Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War. This time we are on to week 33, the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle. That sounded wrong. I totally messed that pronunciation up. This is bothering me. Get at the right height. I somehow make money from this. I don't know what I'm doing. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box and join the Discord. One of the first links down there. Fucking join. Now, let's go ahead and dive into week 33.
We've so far seen the horrors of modern war, the ones on the battlefield anyhow. Today, we'll also see one of the tragic byproducts of the war, the death behind the lines, the painful, lingering horror of epidemic disease.
Is the Spanish flu starting in 2015? I mean, 1915. 1915? Is that when it started? I thought it was a little later than that. I thought it was more towards the end of the war.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we saw the British beat the Turks and Arabs back from the oil supplies in Persia. French attacks continued in the west with minor success. The British and the French were shelling the Dardanelles from the sea, and the Austrians attacked the Russians ineffectively again and again in the Carpathian Mountains. We've seen an awful lot of action on the Eastern Front lately, what with the Austrian and German offensives of the past few weeks. But this week, I'm going to actually focus on the Western Front, where the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle began on March 10th. This was the first
that sounded more correct.
Major attack by the British Expeditionary Force against German entrenched positions. It was conducted by the First Army under General Sir Douglas Haig. Now, one specific problem Haig saw that had become evident by watching the French Champagne offensive throughout the winter was that the big guns would have to deal with the German barbed wire defenses, or the infantry couldn't get across no man's land. Wire cutters were simply too slow and left men too exposed. So, before the battle, the British conducted tests behind the lines to figure out which type of shells did the job best and how long a bombardment was needed. It turned out shrapnel shells were best for ripping the wire into scraps. High explosive shells blew it up into the air, but when it came back down, it was still a problem. The British plan was to break through the German trenches and capture the village and ridge of Aubert, which would disrupt the German communications lines to Lille. To kick off the battle the morning of the 10th, 342 big guns launched a half-hour barrage, the fire being directed by 85 reconnaissance planes. Now, many of those aircraft carried wireless equipment that could send corrections of positions directly to the gunners. This was something really new. Just
proto-radio, then, wasn't it? No, not proto-radio. I mean, the telephone already existed, but it wasn't wireless. I guess that's technically radio technology, isn't it?
As a side note here, more shells were fired in that half-hour barrage than were fired during the entire Boer War, which lasted 2.5 years, little more than a decade earlier. That's how much the nature of war had developed since the turn of the century. In addition to that, to quote Peter Hart, quote, "A fire program was drawn up for every gun, denoting targets, the timings of switches in target, and the number of rounds to be fired. It seemed complex at the time, but this was merely the start of a process that would grow out of all recognition. This was the future," end quote. Indeed it was. There was much of the planning and execution of Neuve-Chapelle that was a hint of things to come. After 4 hours of fighting on March 10th, a lot of it hand-to-hand, Neuve-Chapelle was captured and 4 lines of German trenches were taken. Thing is, you could see the functional conditions for failure almost from the beginning. After taking the Germans totally by surprise, something that would rarely happen again, and after the big initial gains, the infantry had orders to pause for 15 minutes while the artillery shelled the ruins of the village to get any remaining defenders, but there were none. The Germans were hurrying to the strongpoints way to the rear they had set up for precisely such a breakthrough. And then again, when the British rushed into open country beyond the battle zone with victory within reach and the ridge in sight, the orders said they were to again wait. This gave the Germans ample time to regroup and reorganize a new defense, which was machine guns that began.
I mean, I can understand why perhaps the desire to wait, because you also don't want to maybe risk Germans either coming around on the flanks or overextending the line. You don't want to lose your line with those troops that are making the push there. Like, I can understand the desire to be cautious, but also, can see the other side as well.
Began to pulverize the British left flank of leading attackers. The British plans for the attack also called for the reserves to fill the gap left by the leading troops. So you soon had around 9,000 men packed into the small space between Neuve-Chapelle and the original trenches, just hanging around, waiting to go forward. They would have been sitting ducks back there, but very fortunately, the German artillery within range was way low on ammunition. There was also no radio at the
They got
front,
lucky.
and even with the quickest communications available, British junior officers had to pass their info up the chain of command to officers miles behind the battlefront, requesting authority for altering the set-in-stone general plans. Then that information would be considered.
Okay, so this is kind of also then where you see how the Germans are able to be a bit more effective when we're getting this insight into the Allied leadership here, where they are set in stone commands, whereas then the German officers have a bit more leeway. They can pretty much do what they want. They have a bit more mobility in getting things done.
Then the answer would have to go all the way back down the chain of command to the junior officers. What all of this meant...
Well, I guess junior officers probably don't have the independence in the German military either. That probably just is the generals that have that independent ability. Not sure. We're just talking about the British and French right now.
In practical terms, is that between the time that the German lines were broken through and the ridge was really open for the taking, and the time the advance actually happened, there was over 8 hours delay.
Damn.
And the chance was lost with pretty heavy casualties because the Germans had had time to bring in their own reserves. And you know what? 2 days later, in a German counterattack, exactly the same thing happened to the Germans. Well, they didn't break through, but the delays for their changes of plans had given the British time to
Okay, so the Germans also have the same issue with the junior officers. Okay.
install 20 machine guns in strategic positions, and it was the German turn to be stopped with heavy losses. So the casualty lists for the battle ended up being not too far from each other. The British nearly 12,000 and the Germans nearly 9,000, and it was basically a draw. But for the British, it was at least a partial victory, since it rebuilt their reputation as a fighting force in French eyes. It was pretty unfair that they had ever been doubted, but, there you go.
Yeah, the French shouldn't be talking. Their military is pretty incompetent. They can't even take Champagne. They're failing to retake their own land. How embarrassing.
The thing is, it wasn't really the British soldiers, but their commanders that had been doubted. See, most of these men had had a colonial battle outlook, and they expected decisive results with only small casualties. The French leaders, by contrast, came from a tradition of expecting heavy casualties in the field. What Haig had really attempted to do at Neuve-Chapelle was to bite and hold, quickly take a piece of the enemy's line and hold it against counterattack. The idea being that the counterattacks would be far more deadly to the enemy. The problem was that in 1915, the British didn't have the artillery, the shells, and especially the communications to make this work. And the small scale of the bite didn't appeal to Commander-in-Chief John French anyhow. We would see bigger bites in future. Something else we would see more of in the future that we tragically saw a lot of at this time was disease. Now let's look back a few months for a sec. When the Austro-Hungarian army had invaded Serbia last fall, there was an epidemic of typhus among the Austrian troops.
Okay, so
and when they retreated, they left behind an enormous number of sick and wounded troops that had been captured, who were most often held in terribly unsanitary conditions in a war-torn and impoverished nation. And by January 1915, there was a full-blown typhus epidemic in Serbia. It raged for the first 3 months of the year, finally petering out by the summer, but infected as many as 500,000 Serbs, 1 out of every 6 people in the country, with over 200,000
And what, 1 out of every 5 Serbs are dying in this war or something like that?
dying in one of the worst typhus epidemics in history, sending that
God, Serbia got fucked in this war.
little Balkan nation deeper into despair and weakening its armed forces even further. Roughly 70,000 of those who died were troops. How do you cope with this? At the beginning of the outbreak, there were only around 400 doctors in the whole country, and virtually all of them became infected, and around a third of them died. Hospitals were full to overflowing, since you had up to 10,000 new cases a day. There weren't nurses. There weren't even enough grave diggers to keep up. There was one perverse benefit, though. Serbia was crippled by disease both militarily and politically for 6 months, but the Austrians did not invade them. General Typhus was securing the border. This was a week of
Yeah, disease does kind of do that. I guess Austria is being competent for once and actually paying attention to what's happening.
flux. The Austrians who were avoiding Serbia were going nowhere in the Carpathians. The Germans and Russians were regrouping in northern Poland. The Dardanelles were still being bombarded nearly every day. The British finally launched an offensive in the west, but the Germans made a draw. And in Serbia, there were no battles, but disease was rampant. Typhus was not endemic to Serbia prior to the war, mainly because by the 1880s, lice were basically eliminated there by public health campaigns, and it was the lice that mainly spread the disease.
Oh.
See, the tens of thousands of Austrian wounded and sick in the Serbian campaign late in 1914 were all concentrated in the field hospital at occupied Valjevo. Not some of them, all of them. When the Serbs liberated Valjevo, they found a horror scene. Also, huge numbers of displaced refugees from around the country came to Valjevo, where there was no housing for them and no decent hygiene. And when railway depots, by necessity, were turned into local refugee stations, the disease spread throughout the country. Those Austrians sick and wounded had been abandoned by their comrades when they retreated from Valjevo. I find
And again, Austria is abandoning its own people. How is it not crumbling in on itself? It's 1915, and they're not crumbling yet? How? How did they survive to the end of the war as a nation? They should have just crumbled apart like by now. That is one of the big takeaways that I am getting from this series is how the fuck is Austria-Hungary so incompetent yet able to still run as a nation?
I find it very hard to think that their commanders did not know that the disease would spread. And this illness, or any illness, is one of the worst horrors of the war. For this affects those who cannot fight. This kills those who need protection the most, and also those, like doctors, who care and help the most. This was one of the greatest cruelties of the war. Actually, a few months ago, it seemed...
You can imagine it being abandoned by the country you've fought, you either volunteered or have been forced to fight for in this war. And that's just fucked up. That was the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the Great War, week 33. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.